I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're starting a two-part series on Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link for the NES. Today I'll be ranking the 8 dungeons of the game from worst to best, and tomorrow I'll tackle the bosses. The Adventure of Link is the odd one out of the mainline Zelda franchise, looking to innovate in an entirely new direction, and for the time it was considered a hit. And I can guarantee there are people who think back on this game with such warm fondness, taking the rudimentary combat of Zelda 1 and creating a 2D side-scrolling battle system with an incredibly high skill ceiling. But with that height comes difficulty, and for modern audiences, Zelda 2 stands as one of the retro greats of hard games. And the dungeons and exploration are a key aspect, what with many of the game's toughest foes appearing in the various palaces throughout Hyrule. Please be aware I'm playing The Adventure of Link via the Nintendo Switch online NES app, and I am using the ZeldaDungeon.net guide. This game isn't as guide dang it as the original, but there are still moments where it comes in handy. So let's get started. All 8 dungeons in The Adventure of Link, ranked. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. While not technically a dungeon, there is one location in The Adventure of Link that is so infamous in its design, it deserves a place on this list, and it sits at the very bottom of my ranking for the way it practically pushes away new players in their droves. Yes, we're talking about Death Mountain. Faced after beating the first palace of the game, Death Mountain is found after crossing a river village and heading south, and this area is a gigantic mountain range. Various caverns can be found and entered, each leading to a different area or areas, creating a maze-like sense of navigation. It's easy to get lost and lose your way without a guide, and trust me, you will need a guide, because with only 3 lives to your name, taking a wrong turn is effectively asking for a game over. Why? Well, Death Mountain is home to a vast array of enemies, and while many of them fit the area's overall difficulty, there are some notable exceptions. The orange Dairas, who charge Link, doing heavy damage if you don't defeat them with perfectly timed sword slashes. The blue Guraya in this one screen, who is extremely tanky while his boomerangs are incredibly difficult to block. Or worst of all, the red Daira, whose infinite axe-throwing abilities lead to death for most players. These extremely tough foes are placed in the path you need to take, and feel like a real slap in the face to the player who is 100% not leveled up enough to handle them with any sense of ease. And this area is required to obtain the hammer, needed to break boulders on the main road to access the third palace and beyond. Imagine making it to the chamber of the hammer only to lose the last of your life to the red Daira guarding it. Or perhaps you fall into lava while platforming, losing one of your 3 lives to a stupid mistake. At least I have the NES Online Rewind feature, but even then, I'd sometimes just restart at Hyrule Palace and go at it with a fresh take anyway. This area is too expansive to be a regular zone, yet too cruel to be ranked anywhere other than last place on this list. A dungeon that likely scared off many modern players who were off-put by the difficulty spike, especially when the rest of the game is much more forgiving outside of the endgame content. The first palace on our list happens to, well, be the first palace of the game. Hidden in a desert to the northeast of Hyrule Temple, Parappa Palace is your first destination in the game. You can get it pretty much immediately from the game's beginning, after taking a brief stop in Hyrule to get the shield spell, and collecting a heart container on an optional side path with a lot of bubbles. Once you arrive, the brilliant palace theme kicks in and it's time to explore. Only, I find Parappa Palace a little obnoxious for a first dungeon, as it introduces a few mechanics and enemy types that I feel weigh this game down. For example, the tin suits that constantly spawn in the first few rooms. They die in one hit, but getting damaged also causes you to lose experience points. There are many enemies throughout the game that share this trait of causing Link to lose his XP, and it's a game mechanic I'm not fond of. It's the first thing you learn about in this dungeon too. It's a mostly linear experience, as the dungeon doesn't branch off into too many directions, asking you to find a series of keys to unlock locked doors so you can reach the dungeon item and the boss, the usual standard fare. There aren't many tricky room setups due to Link's lack of powers at this point in the game, so there's only so much they can throw at you. I like the collapsing bridge where you can risk grabbing a point bag. I think the mace thrower enemies work really well in this game, reminding me of the Hammer Bros from Mario, but with slightly easier tells. And while I think the Iron Knuckle enemy type is a little overtuned for combat in this first dungeon, they do act as a great wall for the player to overcome, as if you learn how to defeat them, you'll have a much easier time handling the rest of the game. I'm also not the biggest fan of the bubble enemies, what a shock. You can kill them for 50 experience if you have the patience, and you will need patience, but otherwise they're just a hindrance that can sap your magic meter, especially this room of like 3 to 4 of them. They're in every single palace, and it just feels egregious here when you're still relying on just the shield spell, and you barely have any magic to begin with. This dungeon gives you the candle item, which automatically lights up dark caves, allowing you to see enemies inside, but once you gain the candle, there's only one way left to go to the boss, and it's kinda just an enemy gauntlet. I'll save my thoughts on the bosses for tomorrow's video, so they're not going to factor too much, but I appreciate this boss doesn't go too hard against the player, and the skills you learned from fighting Iron Knuckles can definitely apply to this fight. It's a shame this palace couldn't use more creative room design like the rest on the list, which makes it feel a bit bare bones in comparison to the other dungeons, but I digress. Next up on our list, we have the third dungeon of the game, the Island Palace. Found by dropping into a hidden grave and using the newly obtained fairy spell to warp your way out of a cavern, you arrive at the island where the palace resides and enter with a spring in your step. Firstly, the colour palette is gorgeous. I love the dark red rouge, and it gives a very different atmosphere to the greys and blues we've seen before. Our goal in this palace is to collect the raft needed to access Eastern Hyrule and then defeat the boss. I think the first portion of this palace is its strongest aspect, but also shows a majority of what this area has to offer. You have these special rooms that encourage the use of the jump spell to navigate. There are these rooms with low ceilings that spawn falling blocks, which can be tedious if you don't have cover, but luckily this palace gives you that so you can avoid the damage. This palace also introduces these rooms where you have to scale up breakable blocks, all the while enemies like Iron Knuckles wait for you to make a mistake, especially when they start adding the blue variants that can shoot sword beams in there. There's even a brief room where you get to emerge outside of the palace to collect a key. A nice moment of reprieve seeing the sun before delving back into the dark. But that's when my praise ends, sadly, because the rest of the palace rehashes these exact room combinations and they don't feel different enough to excite me. Also, if you want to leave the palace, you need to have enough magic for the jump spell at this elevator, or you're trapped, which really sucks. You should always be able to backtrack out of a palace without needing to use traversal spells, in my opinion. The enemy variety is pretty solid though. They introduce blue Iron Knuckles, which becomes useful when you face the boss of the dungeon. There are also fire mowers, which are introduced here. They fly along the screen and drop flames onto the ground that can hurt you. They add a fun challenge to the rooms they're in, and they're great in every palace coming up. Not a fan of these wolf heads that slowly inch towards you. They seem easy to block at first, but once you're in a hectic room like this, and they keep spawning in, and you're just trying to grab the key and escape with some blocks, it's not fun. This palace ranks lower than the rest simply because while it introduces some fun mechanics, it doesn't stick the landing for the second half of the dungeon. If I can just take a moment of your time, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023, and now I'm back from summer break, I know we can do it. Look at how many of you aren't subscribed. So be sure to parry that subscribe button for more gaming countdowns every Wednesday and Saturday. Back to the video. Rounding out the bottom half of our list is Medoro Palace, also known as the Swamp Palace, and the second you encounter in the game. Now technically, you can visit this place before tackling the brutal Death Mountain, and I suspect that's what the developers intended for. But most players tend to go after Death Mountain first for the extra magic container and access to the downward thrust. Whichever way you go, the dungeon is either a fair step up in difficulty, or a nice change of pace after the brutality of Death Mountain, as long as you ignore the slow slog through the swamp to reach it. It's fairly linear, but has a bit more depth than Parappa Palace, showcasing a variety of new obstacles, such as this room that requires the jumping spell to navigate, while avoiding the mace throwers, or this room where you have to race across before you're dropped into the lava. And while it's not my favourite obstacle by a long shot, the room with the falling blocks prior to the dungeon item provides a decent challenge. I really like this little point bag setup where if you got the downward thrust, you can collect it with ease, a nice reward for doing Death Mountain first. Medoro Palace doesn't have much else outside of the usual enemy gauntlets between rooms, but since it's the second palace in the game, I'm not expecting much more. The rooms that are unique feel more interesting than Parappa, and it's a consistent ride all the way to the boss, which is surprisingly tough. This dungeon is also important for its item, the Handy Glove, which finally allows Link to break breakable blocks with his sword swings. It is needed for the rest of the game, and really opens up a whole host of creativity in future palace design. Medoro Palace doesn't do so much right, as much as it beats out other dungeons that do more wrong, and is consistently decent at everything. I think it deserves a golf clap? And just missing out on my top 3, we have the Hidden Palace, also known as the Three-Eyed Rock Palace, the final one you visit before making your way into the endgame. And I have such mixed feelings about this location because the positives are quite positive, but the negatives for me are really negative. You can find this palace the moment you reach southern Hyrule, using the flute to reveal it by standing within this rock formation, but you'll find yourself unable to progress as there are no keys within the palace, yet locked doors exist. Instead, you need to venture to the hidden town of New Kasuto within the forest. Driven away from the original town of Kasuto once you find them, you must learn the spell, which can only be taught if you have 7 magic segments to your meter, and then use this spell at the back of the town to reveal a chamber containing the magical key. All of this makes the dungeon accessible, and the palace itself is a greatest hits of the various room types from every past dungeon, with a couple tricks of its own. For one, there's a looping series of pits very early on. There's a small puzzle as the rooms look very similar, attempting to trick the player. This palace is also the only one to contain a mini-boss, as the Rebenak boss battle is reused twice at 2 different points. I do wish that mini-bosses had been used throughout the game, similar to how Zelda 1 handed them, but I'm gonna take what I can get. My main complaint with the dungeon, though, I alluded to this earlier, is that this is still just a greatest hits of things we've already gone through. I've seen a majority of these rooms before, and while you can make the case that this dungeon is showing you how far you've come, I would rather have seen more unique stuff like the looping halls. There's also a really rude hidden floor on the way to the dungeon item that feels like a cheap trick, and the ending of the dungeon is very brutal as you're supposed to use the fairy spell during a drop to get to the boss arena. Most people aren't going to realise this. They'll be forced to do a descent, and then an amount of backtracking that is just tedious, to be honest. And that's assuming you have the magic left to even cast Fairy. If you don't, you're out of luck. There's a Link doll to the right of the drop that'll give you a 1-up, but the hallway is packed to the brim with tough enemies, so you'll possibly die trying to reach it. Thank God the boss is great at least. Taking our bronze medal, this may be a controversial pick because many consider this to be one of the toughest dungeons in the game. It's the Ocean Palace, the 5th location you visit, also known as the Green Dungeon. The Ocean Palace is perhaps more than any other, aside from the Great Palace, an absolute maze to navigate. Looking at the full map of the dungeon online, I love that to get through it, you go in a fully clockwise direction, because it completely throws the concept of the prior dungeons asking you to navigate from top left to bottom right out of the window. With a whole host of rooms, some of which share a layout, it's easy to lose your bearings and find yourself scrambling to find a way out of the maze. There are new mage enemies that fire slow-moving fires at you, which make for a fun time when you reach areas with lower ceilings. The dungeon also introduces secret passages to the mix, showing you a rather suspicious dead end at the end of a giant hallway, only to reveal BAM! A secret passage if you jump at the wall. And this is compulsory to find, as the dungeon item and a key needed to progress lie beyond. The enemy placement is generally difficult but fair, with the exception of the final room before the boss, where they place the first iron knuckle at a lower elevation to the player, making it easy for him to hit you, but not for you to hit him. I'm also not a fan of the forced fairy usage right out of the gate, especially with how you have bubbles flying around as well that can sap your magic, leaving you at a disadvantage from the get-go. But at least it is right at the start of the dungeon, when you're likely to still have your magic, as opposed towards the end like in our previous entry. All of this ending with a rather tanky boss that has a difficult hitbox and a mace that hits like a truck. Honestly, more power to the players who beat this palace without a guide. I bet it was satisfying. You know, I can't say I was expecting to place the Maze Palace in my silver medal spot. The fourth palace you visit in the game, found at the end of Maze Island, this is a mage's paradise, filled with wizrobes and projectiles that will aim to take you out as soon as possible. You better hope you found that missing child and brought him back to the town of Darunia, or you're not getting far. Because to succeed in this palace, you need the Reflect spell. This power can reflect magic attacks back at their attackers, and is the only way to defeat the wizrobes that will hound your every step, as well as the boss fight with Karok, which I'll touch on tomorrow. What I like about the Maze Palace is how immediately it splits off at the very start. To the left, a locked door, to the right, the first half of the dungeon. You have to hop through corridors with Stalfos, take a massive leap of faith with your jump spell, and dodge fairly dangerous rooms filled with lava to make it to a series of keys. And of the various lava platforming sequences, these were actually my favourite, requiring precise movements, but allowing me to take my time and not panic. We're also introduced to pits that lead down to lower parts of the palace, one of which you have to fall down to reach the dungeon item, the boots the house down work, mama. I love the item you obtain here, as if you get a game over and return from the start of the game, when you reach Maze Island, you can walk up the river instead of going along the paths to get to the palace. The perks of having boots that let you walk on agua indeed. The left half of the dungeon reuses similar concepts, including the same lava platforming as before, and while the third time reusing that room is a bit much, I still prefer it to some of the other palaces. All of this leading to a fun jump room, followed by some low-hanging ceilings, some more wizrobes, until you reach the boss. I think the main reason why I love this palace is the enemies at play. I have a real love of mages, as they're extremely easy to take out with Reflect, and it gives me a nice bit of therapy following the wizrobes from the first game. The boss is surprisingly easy, which means a free level up, and while there is a ton of lava platforming, the actual path to the boss once unlocked only has one compulsory lava segment. All in all, a solid dungeon that, while it doesn't throw the kitchen sink at you, knows what it wants to do and does it well. Could have used a mini-boss or something, though. Does it surprise anybody that the #1 dungeon of The Adventure of Link is the Great Palace? This level has a completely different vibe from the rest of the dungeons, with this epic entrance as you dispel the barrier set by the King of Hyrule and plunge into the depths of the toughest palace in the game. Now you may be thinking, but Billy, getting here was hell. The Valley of Death? I don't want to do that again. Well, dear viewer, this is perhaps the biggest reason why I love the Great Palace. You get a respawn point. Yes, you heard me. If you game over, you respawn at the start of the palace and not the start of Hyrule. And this probably explains why I love this dungeon so much, because with your lives you have, you're making excursions into the dungeon, getting better at fighting the enemies, maybe game overing, but learning a little more each time. It's like a roguelike, just with a dungeon whose layout doesn't change. Now, I followed a guide to get me through the palace, but even with the guide, I found myself confused and lost and without direction multiple times. Having to run from the enemy Fokas, souped up iron knuckles that can decimate your health bar, it was exhilarating. Especially this room with the breakable blocks, my god. Or how about getting ambushed by a gigantic slime? I knew it was coming, I've seen footage of it before, but for someone who doesn't know, that's a jump scare. For me, it's a note that I'm getting close to the end. The layout is so varied with so many different paths to take that charting your way through the dungeon is a challenge in itself. And it's perfect, as you don't have any locked doors barring your way. all set to the best remix of the palace theme. All the while, the grandiose golden bricks, blue tapestries, and ever-present atmosphere accompany your descent, until you reach the boss of this dungeon in the Grand Hall, and once slain, you obtain the Triforce after one final fight. That being said, I absolutely despise that if you don't make it to the Thunderbird without half of your magic meter, end of the road, my man. Awful design there. They should give you a free red potion before you enter the boss room so that you're always ready to take on the Thunderbird. Now, just the fact that they have entirely new enemies in the Great Palace unique to this zone, and they're all bird people? Are the Fokker secretly just Rito? This theory is beginning to take shape. It's the perfect blend of difficulty, while if you take the optimal path through the palace, it's actually manageable because you don't end up taking on the most dangerous of rooms. I'm really glad I got the chance to beat the Great Palace and this game. It's been a bucket list backlog for a long time, and I can finally say I conquered the adventure of Link. Congratulations, Great Palace, the top spot is yours. And that's it for today's video. Which palace is your favorite? Leave your thoughts down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all my latest content. Tune in tomorrow where I rank the bosses. My socials are on screen now. Feel free to follow me where you feel comfortable. I'd recommend my Twitter or my Blue Sky, and a massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon for supporting me for another month. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys next time. Adios.